The war had been over for 23 days, and Andromeda Tonks had not yet learned what to do with herself. That was the thing no one mentioned in the immediate aftermath of a war, the specific quality of emptiness that followed the lifting of fear. Not relief. Relief was a warm, definite thing. What Andromeda felt was more complicated, a blankness where the vigilance had been, a recurring impulse to look over her shoulder at nothing. The threat was gone. She kept checking anyway. She had heard about the boy the same way she had heard about everything in those first weeks, obliquely, through grief. A conversation between two witches at the apothecary. A line in a letter from a cousin of Ted's who moved in ministry circles. The whisper that had moved through what remained of the wizarding community, like water through sand. Harry Potter was alive. He had been taken somewhere Muggle, for some reason no one would explain plainly. Ted had found the address. He had Muggle methods for things like this, a practical relationship with public records, a patience with phone books and electoral rolls, a fluency in the bureaucratic vocabulary of a world that had never known he existed. He had handed her a piece of paper and said, carefully, that she didn't have to. She had looked at the address for a long time before she agreed with him. The healer she brought occupied the useful middle ground between qualified and experienced, certain enough of his methods to be trusted, uncertain enough of his reputation to be discreet. She had told him what she needed: an examination, proper documentation, a second professional opinion on what a survived killing curse left behind in an infant, and he had agreed with the practical willingness of someone who had not yet learned to refuse odd requests on grey November mornings. The lime green of his robes was the only bright thing on Privet Drive. It was a relentlessly ordinary street. Andromeda had been to Muggle neighborhoods before. Ted had made sure of that, patiently and without fanfare, over the years of their marriage. But there was something about Little Whinging that was ordinary with intent. Every lawn was trimmed to the same width. Every car occupied the same relative position in its driveway. It was a street that had decided, collectively, to have no surprises whatsoever. Standing in it in her best Muggle coat, dark wool, sensible boots, the emerald pin at her collar that she had forgotten to remove, Andromeda felt the exposed feeling of someone who was, constitutionally, a surprise. Number 4 was the third house on the left. She had rehearsed what she would say, and abandoned the rehearsal twice on the train, because the problem with prepared things was that they required the other person to respond predictably, and she had no reason to expect anything from Petunia Dursley except the closed face of someone who had been handed a choice she hadn't wanted. She knocked. The woman who opened the door was thin and fair, and wearing an expression that suggested the morning had already disappointed her before Andromeda appeared in it. Her eyes moved from Andromeda to the healer and back, and something shuddered in her face. Not fear, exactly. Something more tired than fear. "We're not," Petunia began. "My name is Andromeda Tonks," Andromeda said. "I knew Lily." Petunia's hand tightened on the door. It did not close. The healer, who had been briefed to remain quiet until asked, stood 2 steps behind Andromeda on the path, with his bag held in both hands, looking at a spot approximately 12 inches to the left of everyone present. "Lily's been gone 3 weeks," Petunia said. Her voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone who has found that the flattest voice holds the most. "I know," Andromeda said. "That's why I'm here." Harry was in the sitting room, in a pram that was slightly too large for the space. He was awake. He had his father's hair, already impossible at 15 months, already pointing in 6 directions at once, and he was regarding Andromeda with the fixed, assessing attention of a small child who hasn't yet learned to pretend disinterest. His eyes were very green. They were the particular green Andromeda had seen in photographs of Lily, and they landed on her now with the uncanny force of a resemblance she had not quite prepared herself for. The lightning bolt scar on his forehead was paler than she had expected, a clean, precise mark, not a wound, as if something had been written there rather than torn. The healer asked permission, quietly, and then examined him. The diagnostic procedure was neither loud nor dramatic. What Andromeda understood in advance, because she had asked, there would be a residue. A rebounded killing curse left something behind at the point of contact, identifiable and nameable, consistent with what the magical community knew of that night. She had prepared herself to hear that finding described and confirmed, and then to hear that it was stable, and then to leave with the documentation she had come for. The healer found the first layer. He identified it without difficulty. He moved on. Then he was quiet for a moment, longer than the examination should have required. He looked at Andromeda. He looked back at the child. He cast the diagnostic again, and that repetition, the choice to repeat it, was the most informative thing that happened in the sitting room of 4 Privet Drive that morning. "There is a second layer," he said, finally. He kept his voice professionally level, which was itself information. "Beneath the residue of the rebounded curse, something distinct. It presents as anchored, as if it belongs there, which it does not, and as intentional, and I have no protocol for it whatsoever. Can you remove it?" "No." He paused, which was the habit of a man who had learned to pause before saying things that couldn't be taken back. "Not without risk of significant harm to the child. I cannot diagnose it. I can document it and recommend monitoring at close intervals, no more than 2 months between examinations." Petunia, who had said nothing during the examination, except to confirm where the light switch was, said, "What does that mean?" "It means," Andromeda said, "that whatever happened to him on the 31st is not entirely finished." The healer packed his bag. He said he would file a report, and that given the unusual nature of the finding, he would send Andromeda a copy directly and await her instructions. She thanked him. She saw him to the door. He left? She did not. Petunia was watching her from the kitchen doorway, with an expression that was working very hard to be unwelcoming and not quite succeeding, because underneath the unfriendliness was something that looked uncomfortably like recognition of a person who was not going to be dislodged by the usual methods. "You need to leave," Petunia said. "My husband will be home." "I'm not taking him," Andromeda said. She said it clearly and first, because she suspected that was the fear. "I know about the protection. I know why Dumbledore placed him here." The letter was visible on the table behind Petunia, folded and refolded, the corners soft with handling. "This house, this household, this choice, I am not contesting it. I understand that Harry has to stay, and I have no intention of removing him." She didn't. Whatever she thought of the logic, a child in this house with these muggles, because ancient magic required a blood relative in residence, the protection was real, and Andromeda Tonks had survived enough war to know that real protection was not a thing you discarded on principle. "Then what?" Petunia said. "Do you want?" From somewhere outside came the distant sound of a car slowing, then continuing past. Vernon Dursley, Andromeda estimated, was not yet home. "I want to be on this street every morning," Andromeda said, "until someone can tell me what is inside that child's scar. That is what I want. It is not negotiable." She paused. From the sitting room came a small, companionable sound. Harry, apparently satisfied with his assessment of the ceiling, making his views known to no one in particular. "And I want to make sure that if something happens, if the dark magic shifts, if he wakes screaming? No one in this house has to face that alone, and without knowing what they are looking at. Petunia looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned and went into the kitchen and put the kettle on. It was not an invitation. It was, Andromeda thought, the closest thing to one that the morning was prepared to offer. She followed. She sat at the kitchen table without being asked to sit, and through the hallway she could see the pram, and in the pram the dark-haired, green-eyed child who had already exhausted 2 adults and 1 nervous healer, and was now apparently interested in his own fist. Petunia set a mug in front of her without asking how she took it. The tea was too strong. Andromeda drank it anyway. She didn't leave. She hadn't chosen this. That was the thing Petunia kept returning to, in the way she returned to difficult things. Not dwelling exactly, but circling, the way you circle a bruise with your fingers to confirm it is still there. She had made a choice in the early hours of secutive November, standing in her front door in her dressing gown, with an unopened letter in one hand and a cold baby in the other. She had made that choice deliberately and did not regret it, because whatever Vernon said in his louder moments, she was not the kind of person who left a baby on a doorstep in November. But she had chosen to take the child in. She had not chosen to also acquire, as part of the arrangement, a dark-haired witch who knocked at her door every morning at 8:30. Andromeda had found lodgings. This was the first thing. She appeared on a Tuesday, 4 days after the initial visit, with a rental agreement for a flat 2 streets over, and the information that she would be arriving daily and leaving before the situation became unmanageable for anyone. She meant Vernon. She had correctly identified the problem and was managing it in advance, which was one of the more infuriating things about her. She arrived each morning between 8 and 9. She brought things. A baby monitor on the second visit, with the explanation that it was a muggle device and required nothing of Petunia except plugging in. Petunia had looked at it for a moment and plugged it in, because refusing something useful would have required an explanation to Vernon, and she was conserving her explanations for more significant battles. She checked the monitor 3 times that first night, which was not information she intended to share with anyone. Andromeda stayed through the morning. She was in the sitting room with Harry while Petunia managed Dudley and the house and the ongoing situation of having a witch in her sitting room. She did not use magic, or at least Petunia did not observe her using magic, which amounted to the same thing in practice. She left before 4, which was when Vernon's car turned into the drive. This was not a coincidence. Vernon was furious. He had been furious since the original visit, and remained so in the concentrated, sustained way of a man who has encountered a problem and cannot locate the lever that fixes it. He rang a solicitor on the 3rd day, and the solicitor said there was very little legally actionable about a woman knocking at a door and sitting in a kitchen. He rang a different solicitor on the 5th day with the same result. He informed Petunia he was considering ringing the police, and Petunia relayed this to Andromeda the following morning, and Andromeda said, with the polite patience of someone who has already done this calculation, that there was nothing illegal about walking down a public street and knocking at a door. Vernon did not ring the police. He and Petunia argued in the kitchen after dark, in the low-voiced way of people who know there are sleeping children upstairs. "I want her gone," he said. "I know," Petunia said. "She has no right to simply walk into our—" "I know. If you'd just tell her. Vernon." She turned from the sink. "She doesn't respond to the usual approaches. I have tried. She intends to stay, and I cannot make her leave without involving the kind of scene that the neighbors would discuss for years." He gave her the look, the one that said he did not understand her, and could not decide whether this was her fault or his. She found it less upsetting than he probably intended. She turned back to the sink. Outside, the December garden was bare. 2 streets away, presumably, Andromeda Tonks was in a rented flat, doing whatever it was she did when she wasn't here. Petunia rinsed the mug and tried not to consider that she had developed a daily schedule around someone else's presence without ever making the decision to. The cupboard question arose in the 3rd week. Harry was in the cupboard under the stairs. She had put him there because it was convenient and contained, and kept him separate from Dudley's room, where Dudley had established clear positions on the matter of his own space. She had not thought of it as permanent, only as the arrangement that had come to her in the middle of the night, and which she had not yet revisited. Andromeda arrived one morning, went through to check on Harry, and did not comment on the cupboard. She went home. She arrived the following morning with a flat-pack cot, purchased, apparently, from the hardware shop on the high street. She had Ted with her. His visits to Privet Drive were generally brief, confined to the doorstep, and between them they carried the cot upstairs to the 2nd bedroom, without asking Petunia whether they might. They assembled it. Ted mentioned something about a stiff hinge and a drop of lubricant, and that was the full extent of the conversation on the subject. They left before Petunia had formed a coherent objection. She stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment. Then she went up and looked at the cot, which occupied the 2nd bedroom that was technically Dudley's overflow, and technically not Harry's room, because Harry's room was the cupboard under the stairs, because that was the arrangement. The cot was clean and sturdy, and in a room with a window. She didn't move it back. There was an afternoon in that same December when the house was quiet and both children were asleep, and Andromeda had stayed later than usual. They were at the kitchen table with their tea, Andromeda with the healer's notes spread around her mug, Petunia with nothing in front of her except her own hands. The baby monitor on the counter produced the small, settling sounds of Harry breathing. Neither woman was speaking. Andromeda was looking at something past Petunia's left shoulder. Her face had an expression that Petunia couldn't quite name. Too careful to be sadness, too still to be thought. It was the expression of someone who had also, at some point, been refused admission to a room they had expected to enter. Petunia did not say this. It would have required opening a door she intended to keep shut, and she was not in the business of opening doors she intended to keep shut. She looked at her tea. Andromeda looked at whatever it was she was looking at. The monitor made its small sounds. They drank their tea. Ted's visit that day was the first extended one. He was a solidly built man, comfortable in his muggle clothing and manner in a way that Andromeda, for all her years of practice, was still occasionally not quite. He had tea in the hallway. There was tea, and he was standing there, and there was no other socially coherent option, and drank it, standing up without taking up more of the space than was necessary. Petunia noticed this and said nothing about it. At some point, while Andromeda went through her notes, Ted held Harry. It was simply something he was good at. Not performing it, not narrating it, just holding the child as if it were a thing that wanted doing. Harry examined Ted's face with the deliberate attention he gave everything, and then settled into his arms. Ted looked out the window at the December garden. Petunia found something to do in the kitchen with her back to the sitting room, because she had decided she was not going to be moved by a man being gentle with her sister's child, and she found it easier to maintain this decision when she wasn't watching. By January, the pattern had established itself. Andromeda every morning, Ted once or twice a week, the cot in the 2nd bedroom, a fact that no one was discussing because there was nothing to discuss. The letter remained folded in the kitchen drawer, its creases soft with handling. Petunia did not reread it. She knew what it said about ancient magic and blood and what she was providing. She had made her choice in November, and she was living inside it. On a grey afternoon at the end of January, she stood at the net curtain and watched Andromeda leave. The street was empty and cold. Andromeda had a good wool coat, the coat of someone who had made careful choices about lasting things, and she walked without looking back. She never looked back when she left. She went and she returned tomorrow. That was all the arrangement required. Petunia let the curtain fall straight. She thought of the letter. She thought briefly of Lily, and then she stopped thinking of Lily because Dudley was in the sitting room and Harry was upstairs in a room with a window, and there was a house to run, and she had a great deal of practice at stopping when she needed to. She went back to Dudley. He had not anticipated this, which was itself informative. Dumbledore walked the length of Privet Drive on a February morning with the particular quality of awareness that came from 100 years of learning how unexpected things tended to begin. Quietly, in the shape of something that shouldn't matter, in a place no one thought to watch closely, he had arranged this street with some care, the squib on Wisteria Walk, the letter in the drawer, the bond of blood, sealed and operating, as far as his considerable faculties could determine, without incident. He had expected complications, when they came, from the direction of the wizarding world. He had not expected them to arrive in the form of a disowned black, who rented a flat 2 streets away and knocked every morning at 8:30. Arabella Figg had sent her report 3 weeks ago. A dark-haired woman, not a muggle, coming and going daily. Petunia Dursley's expression upon opening the door each time, not the expression of someone being coerced. He had been meaning to come sooner. He had been occupied with the slow work of sorting a war's aftermath, accounting for the living and the dead and the dangerous, and had told himself the situation would wait. It had waited 6 weeks. He was here now. Petunia opened the door before he knocked. She was thin and fair and armoured in her ordinariness, the way some people armoured themselves in steel. She looked at him with an expression that contained, beneath its hostility, a complicated satisfaction, the expression of a person who has been handed an opportunity and intends to use it correctly. "There is already a witch coming to this house every morning," she said. "I should like to know what exactly you intend to do about it." Dumbledore considered her over his half-moon spectacles. "Perhaps," he said, "I might come in." The kitchen was warm and smelled of tea that had been made too recently. He sat where he was invited to sit, which was not at the head of the table, and accepted the cup placed in front of him with a grudging precision that said civility was not agreement. Petunia told him what she knew, the woman's name, her schedule, the cot now installed in the 2nd bedroom, the healer's visit in November, with the tone of a woman presenting evidence. She watched him as she did it. Dumbledore listened. He had always been very good at listening in ways that revealed nothing. When Andromeda Tonks arrived at 8:07, she found him in the kitchen. She paused in the doorway for perhaps 2 seconds, long enough to assess, not long enough to show alarm, and then she set her things on the counter and looked at him directly. She was approximately 28 years old, with her mother's dark colouring, and there was something in her bearing that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the particular quality of determination the Black family produced in its most capable members, the ones who did not do as they were told. "Andromeda Tonks," she said, not introducing herself, confirming herself. "I know who you are," Dumbledore said. "I imagine you know who I am. Perhaps we might speak plainly." He was formal and measured, and he chose his words with the care that 100 years of consequence had taught him. "The bond of blood," he told her, "was architecture before it was magic. Its foundation was not the letter and not the incantation, but experience. Harry's lived experience of this house as home. Home was not a legal category or a geographical location. Home was the smell of a particular kitchen, the voice that said his name in the way that meant safety, the face that came when he cried, the charm measured attachment. If Harry's primary attachment shifted, if the face that meant comfort became a face that arrived each morning from a flat 2 streets away and left each afternoon, then the foundation shifted too, and what Voldemort could not cross became something closer to a suggestion than a wall. He did not accuse her of bad faith. He was, in his way, genuinely respectful of her. He simply told her that she was an unknown variable in a system that had been constructed with great precision, and that unknown variables in precise systems rarely remained unknown in their effects. Andromeda reached into her bag and placed the healer's report on the table between them. She did not raise her voice. She was good at that, at occupying a position of challenge without the challenge being audible. The dark magic in Harry's scar, she said, was not something the wizarding world's institutional apparatus was monitoring or investigating. She had brought a healer in November. The healer had found something he could not explain, could not remove, and could only recommend examining at 2 monthly intervals. There was no one in this house who would recognize an escalation if it occurred, no one who would know what they were seeing or what to do about it. She gestured briefly at the kitchen around them. She was not removing Harry. She was not competing with Petunia Dursley for the role of the person this house meant to him. She was watching a fragment of unexplained dark magic embedded in an infant, and she was doing it because no one else was. She was simply additional. Dumbledore looked at the report for a long moment. Then he said, "May I examine him?" Harry was in the sitting room, awake, occupied with the business of examining his own hands with considerable seriousness. He looked up at Dumbledore's approach with no particular alarm. He was not yet a child who treated strangers as threats, which said something about the quality of his months here so far. Dumbledore crouched, which cost his knees rather more than it once had, and looked at the scar. He was 100 years old. He had handled things that had left no mark on the material world, but had left considerable marks on his understanding of how magic could be bent and turned back on itself. He knew the residue of a rebounded killing curse the way a physician knows the look of a particular fever. Not from a textbook, but from having seen it before and having survived the seeing. The first layer was as expected. The second layer was not something he had a name for yet. He had suspicions, careful, half-formed, terrible things that he hadn't yet spoken aloud and didn't intend to. But he hadn't confirmed them, and he would not allow himself to act on suspicions of this magnitude without confirmation. He straightened. He let none of this reach his face. He told Andromeda. The dark magic was unusual, residual, currently stable, of uncertain origin. Monitoring was wise. Continued examination at regular intervals was prudent. He said it as if he had given her nothing useful, which was technically true. But she had been raised as a black, and the blacks were educated in the art of reading what was not said, and he suspected the fraction of a second before his expression had settled had told her more than he intended. The compromise took less than 10 minutes. She accepted his first condition without discussion. Harry's location would not be shared outside her household. She accepted the second. No magic in the house, unless medically necessary. The third she met with a qualification that she delivered with the calm of someone who had already thought it through entirely. She would not tell Harry about the wizarding world before Dumbledore determined the appropriate time. She would not volunteer the full picture. But if Harry asked her a direct question, she would not lie to him. Dumbledore was quiet. In his experience, the people who insisted on not lying were often more consequential than the ones who lied freely, because they required the truth to be something they could defend. He found the quality generally admirable, and occasionally very difficult. "That seems," he said, "a reasonable position." She nodded once. The arrangement was concluded. He left along the grey Surrey street in his long purple robes, which drew the sideways looks from neighbours that Petunia Dursley undoubtedly found excruciating. He did not adjust himself to spare her the difficulty. He was thinking about the second layer. He was thinking about what it was and what it meant, and what it would eventually require of the boy. And he was thinking that he had perhaps 12 or 15 years in which to arrange the conditions that would make what was required survivable, and that this was not as much time as he would have liked. Andromeda watched him from the front step. She had won something this morning. She had his grudging sanction, which was not nothing, and she was not comfortable with the feeling. The way he had looked at Harry's scar stayed with her, not alarmed, not surprised, but quietly, privately calculating, the expression of a man reordering what he already knew. She was not sure what he had recognized in the scar. She was certain he had recognized something. She went back inside. He was 22 years old in April of 1982, and he looked it in the way that certain men look their age, only in the sense that the damage has settled in precisely. The grey at his temples was not genetic. The lines around his eyes were not earned slowly. He had been sleeping in a borrowed room above a pub in a market town he had chosen for its cheapness and its neutralness, and he had been doing, for the past 5 months, approximately nothing. Not entirely nothing. He had found casual work where he could, the kind of work that asked for no references, asked no questions about the gaps, and did not mind when he missed 3 days a month without explanation. He had read 3 books he could not later recall. He had written letters he had not sent, to people who had not sent letters to him either, because the word that kept coming up was condolences, and condolences required the person receiving them to perform a particular kind of gratitude he did not currently have the energy for. James was dead. Lily was dead. Sirius was in Azkaban, which was the kind of thing that you learned, and then went on learning, daily, in the way of facts that refused to settle into the background where facts belonged. The charge was betrayal. Sirius Black had sold James and Lily Potter to Voldemort, and then, when confronted in a crowded Muggle street by Peter Pettigrew, had killed him and 12 others besides. This was what had happened. The Ministry had confirmed it without a trial, which was, he supposed, how things were done in the aftermath of a war, when the cells needed filling and the evidence was a street full of dead people and a rat's tail. He could not make himself believe it. He did not say this to anyone, because there was no one to say it to. The first owl came on a Thursday in late March. He knew the name, Andromeda Tonks, née Black, a woman who had burned herself off the family tapestry for a Muggle-born husband, and about whom he had heard only the fact of that choice, not the person behind it. The letter was direct, which he appreciated after months of language that coiled around the edges of things. She explained the scan results in 3 precise sentences. She described the second layer of dark magic, unremovable, undiagnosable, something no healer had protocol for, with the calm of someone who had already spent weeks being frightened and had moved past it into something more useful. Then, Harry needed people who had known his parents. The people who should have been arriving at his door were dead or imprisoned. She was asking anyway. He read it 3 times. He did not respond. She wrote again a week later. "Shorter," she said. "You don't have to come for him. Come for yourself, if it's easier. Come because James was your friend, and there is a boy with his hair who laughs at the wrong moments." He put it under the book he was not reading, and did not sleep that night. He took the train to Little Whinging on a Sunday in April, grey morning with flat cloud that could not decide whether to clear. He sat in the last carriage. James had always taken the first carriage. The seats faced forward. James felt strongly about the direction of travel, and Remus had spent 21 years in the last car, opposite ends of the train, and they had both always gotten a window. This was a thing he had thought about in the months since November, with a frequency he did not consider healthy. He wore his mended robes, pressed the night before. He was not sure why this mattered. It did. The street was relentlessly ordinary. He found the house without difficulty and knocked, and Andromeda Tonks opened the door. She had her family's colouring, the dark hair, the particular quality of bone structure that made the blacks recognizable even when they were nothing like each other, but none of the brittle precision that the name called up in him. She was steadier than the bearing suggested. She had the quality of someone who had made a decision too consequential to revisit, and had made peace with that. She looked at him with the particular expression of a person who has prepared for a version of a meeting, and knows that the version that showed up may not match. "He's awake," she said. Harry was in the sitting room with a wooden pull toy shaped like a duck. He was approximately 20 months old, and approached the duck with the seriousness of someone engaged in important work. He looked up when Remus came in, assessed him without ceremony or fear, and reached out one hand in the general direction of Remus's face. Remus picked him up. He looked at the ceiling for a full minute. Harry was warm and smelled of something powdery, and held on to Remus's collar with the absent certainty of a child who had decided that grip was sensible. He had James's hair, black and impossible, and pointing in 6 directions, and Lily's eyes, which were closed now because he was occupied with the collar. Remus was glad about the eyes being closed. He was barely managing the hair. Andromeda, from the doorway, said nothing. She waited. He understood already that this was characteristic of her. When he could look at a horizontal surface again, he sat down on the floor, and Harry immediately held the duck's head up to him in a brief, solemn offering, and then changed his mind and tried to eat it instead. They talked on the front step while Harry slept. She told him the full detail: the scan, the healer's inability to remove or diagnose the second layer, the documented evidence that the dark magic was intentional and anchored rather than simply residual. She told him about Dumbledore's visit in February, the 3 conditions, what Dumbledore had said about the dark magic being stable. She told him about the fraction of a second before Dumbledore's expression had settled, which had told her that stable was not the same as explained. Remus was quiet for a long moment. "Does Dumbledore know what it is?" Andromeda considered. "He knows more than he is telling me." He did not put in words what he thought about that. He had a complicated history with not putting things in words where Dumbledore was concerned. It had seemed, for 21 years, like the appropriate response to a man whose authority was real and whose information was always partial. He was beginning to wonder whether he had been too accommodating. He asked about the full moon, not evasively, as he sometimes did with people who did not know, but directly, because she clearly already knew. She confirmed it without fuss. She understood the schedule it imposed. She was not asking him to work around it, only with it. He mentioned the wolfsbane potion, without specifying that he could not reliably afford it. She seemed to understand this without him saying so, in the way she seemed to understand most things, not by being told, but by having already thought it through. "Once a month, when you can," she said. "When you can't, send a note. That's sufficient." He nodded. He looked at the street, the careful lawns, the parked cars, the houses that looked like an argument for a particular idea of a life. Somewhere inside number 4, a boy with James's hair was sleeping. He would grow up and ask about his father, and someone would have to tell him the truth about his father, which was that James Potter had been brilliant and infuriating and generous and a deeply mediocre loser at Quidditch, which was his best subject. Someone would have to tell him that Lily Potter could brew any potion in the textbook in under the stated time, and never let anyone forget it, and that she had been the better student by a significant margin, and had let James think otherwise on certain occasions, because she was kind in that particular, specific way. He would tell him these things. He was the only one left who could. "When he's old enough," he said, "I'll tell him about them." "I know you will," she said. He walked back to the station at the end of the afternoon. The grey morning had become a grey afternoon, without distinguishing itself at any point. He walked with his hands in his pockets, and his shoulders lower than they had been in November, which was a small thing, and not a small thing simultaneously. He did not look back. Not because there was nothing worth seeing, because if he looked back, he would see the shape of the life that should have happened. James and Lily at their own door, Sirius making terrible jokes over tea, a baby with impossible hair growing up with a full set of people who loved him rather than a woman who had chosen to stay, and a man who was only now, 5 months late, choosing the same. He was not ready for that particular view yet. He would come back in May. He had already decided this before he reached the end of the street. He thought, on the train home, about Harry holding the duck's head up to him, a solemn, brief gift, immediately reconsidered in favor of eating it. He had not laughed at the wrong moment in 5 months. He thought there might be a version of a life remaining in which he could. She was 9 years old in the summer of 1982, which was old enough to understand that her mother was doing something important, and not quite old enough to stop minding that the important thing happened somewhere else. It was not a complaint she felt entitled to make. Her mother explained things when asked, carefully and completely, in the particular way that meant she had already anticipated the question. There was a baby. The baby had dark magic embedded in his scar that no healer could remove or explain. The baby was in a Muggle household where no one would recognize an emergency if it arrived. Her mother had decided to be there instead of here. These were facts, and they were also the entire shape of the past 8 months of their lives. Andromeda Tonks, home for some of every week. Never entirely home, always partly somewhere on a Surrey street, with a name Nymphadora had begun to say without thinking. Privet Drive, the place where the important thing was. She packed a bag that was too large for a week and took the train with her father on a Saturday morning and arrived at number 4 Privet Drive with the stated purpose of being helpful. The actual purpose was to see what her mother had decided to live inside, and why the decision had the quality it had, the quality of something chosen so completely there was no longer any choosing going on, only the choice, made and made and made every morning when her mother put on her coat and walked 2 streets over and knocked. Privet Drive was exactly as her mother had described it, relentlessly orderly, every lawn the same width, every car parked in the same relative position in its drive, the entire street conducting itself like a person trying very hard not to be noticed. Number 4 was the 3rd house on the left. Petunia Dursley opened the door, took in Nymphadora's suitcase and her bubblegum pink hair, and made a face that was working hard at unwelcome, but had been somewhat worn down by familiarity with the project of tolerating unexpected arrivals, and stood aside to let her in. Harry was in the sitting room. He was 2 years old, and he had already, on the morning she arrived, attempted to feed a wooden pull-toy duck to the sitting-room carpet. He looked up at her from his position on the floor with complete calm, not frightened, not uncertain, just cataloguing. And she got her first look at him properly. James Potter's hair, black and impossible, pointing in 6 directions at once. Lily Potter's eyes, which she recognized from photographs her mother kept. A green so specific it looked considered, the exact shade of dragonfly wing she had once turned her own eyes on a dare. The green that meant you were standing very close to something that mattered. He reached for her nose. She turned it into a pig's snout without thinking. She had been a metamorph Magos since birth, which meant the ability was as instinctive as breathing, which meant it sometimes happened the way breathing happened, without decision, in response to something immediate. He reached for her nose, and she gave him something better to reach for. It was not a considered choice. It was the obvious thing. Harry laughed. It was a full-body laugh, both fists clenching and releasing with the effort of it. He fell over sideways into the carpet and stayed there, looking at the ceiling, still laughing, fists still clenched. From the kitchen doorway, Petunia Dursley stood watching. Her expression was doing 2 things at once. It was attempting horror, and it was attempting not to smile, and both attempts were failing in favor of a third thing that she did not appear to have a name for. She watched Harry on the floor for a moment, and then she went back to the kitchen without saying anything. Nymphadora filed this observation away. Andromeda was at the kitchen table with her notes. She had looked up at Harry's laugh, and there was something below the line where her expressions usually lived, something that shifted in her chest, settled somewhere lower, the quality of a breath released that she had been holding for 8 months without being precisely aware of it. Nymphadora had no name for this yet either. She was 9. She would eventually find the word, and the word was relief, but relief was too small for what it was. It was the relief of a woman who had chosen to stay somewhere, for reasons she understood entirely and felt only partly, who was sitting at a kitchen table on a grey August morning, watching a 2-year-old fall over from laughing, understanding for the first time what the partly was. Nymphadora, on the sitting-room floor, changed her nose back. Harry looked at her with the expression of someone from whom a gift has just been removed without explanation. She gave it back. The week had a shape she had not anticipated. It was not tidy. She was not tidy. She had never been, and she had learned by this point to treat her own clumsiness as a feature of the environment rather than an interruption to it. She tripped over Harry's duck on the 2nd morning and knocked her shoulder hard into the doorframe and startled herself so completely that her hair went red, involuntarily and without consultation, in the half-second of alarm. Harry, watching from the floor, made a sound that was not yet a word and reached for her hair with both hands. She turned it blue. His face lit up. She turned it green. He fell over, deliberately, with great satisfaction, and laughed at the ceiling again. He was going to be the kind of person who laughed at things on purpose, she thought. He was already clearly the kind of person who fell over on purpose in order to make a point. She settled eventually on the pink, bubblegum pink, a shade she had discovered by accident months ago and kept because it was the silliest available color, and she had already decided that silliness was underrated. He loved it. He pointed at it every morning, as if it might have changed overnight, and was pleased each time it had not. Dudley Dursley, slightly older and considerably more cautious, watched these proceedings from the bottom of the stairs with his eyes very wide, and an expression that oscillated between alarmed and envious, and could not quite settle. He watched Nymphadora change her nose back to ordinary, and then to a pig snout again, and was silent in the specific way of a child who has seen something that doesn't fit into the categories he has been given and is revising the categories. Vernon Dursley avoided the sitting room during these hours. Petunia made tea. This was, Nymphadora was beginning to understand, Petunia's structural response to the continued existence of witches in her house. She performed hospitality in the narrowest possible register that still qualified as hospitality. It did not mean she welcomed the situation. It meant she had decided that the situation would be managed, and management required tea. Ted came on the Saturday. He was good with Harry in the way he was good with most things, quietly, without announcement, without requiring anyone to notice that he was being good. He held Harry while Andromeda sorted through her notes from the healer's latest report, and Harry examined Ted's face with the fixed, systematic attention he gave all faces, not uncertain. Nymphadora had been watching closely enough to understand, but cataloguing, memorizing, building a map of the people he was going to keep. Ted stood in the sitting room light and let himself be added to the map. Sunday. She packed her bag. She hugged her mother at the door. Her mother's arms had a particular quality, present and careful and arranged, always, around more than one space at once. She smelled of the particular wool of her coat and the faint lavender she kept in the pockets, and she was here and not here in the specific way she had been all year. Harry waved from the hallway. He was still in his pajamas, half awake, assembling the morning with the methodical seriousness he brought to assembly, but he waved with both hands when she looked back at him, and she laughed, and he looked at her pink hair with the expression of someone confirming that the important things are where you left them. The train back was longer than the train there always was. Her mother went inside. The door closed. Privet Drive was exactly as ordinary as it had always been. In the lodgings that evening, alone, Andromeda thought, "He is 2 years old. He has not asked for any of this. He cannot ask yet. He can wave goodbye with both hands and fall over on purpose and hold a cup of tea in both palms with total seriousness, and he is doing all of these things with his whole self, which is already, for 2 years old, quite a lot of self." She thought, "It's enough for now. It will have to be enough." She had been thinking this continuously for 8 months. She was going to need to keep thinking it for considerably longer. By the time Harry was 4, the names had settled. He called her Andy. This had not been suggested or encouraged. He had arrived at it the way small children arrive at things, through the oblique process of elimination. He had tried Dromeda for approximately a week, which made her feel like a geological feature. And then one morning he had simply looked at her across the kitchen table and said, "Andy," with complete authority. And that was that. She did not correct it. Andromeda was a name for the Black family tapestry and official correspondence, and people she was trying to impress. Andy, it turned out, was sufficient for a kitchen in Surrey at 7:30 in the morning. He called Nymphadora Dora. Nymphadora, who had spent 11 years insisting on Tonks and had developed a considered philosophy about the name Nymphadora that involved never using it under any circumstances, accepted this from Harry with the resigned grace of someone who has met an opponent she cannot argue with. He was 4. He had decided. That was the end of it. He called Remus Mooney. Remus had told him it was a nickname from school friends, which was true as far as it went, and Harry had taken it in with the patient seriousness he brought to everything Remus told him, and had used it ever since. The equilibrium at Privet Drive was 3 years in the making, and looked, by 1984, like a set of daily practices rather than a relationship. Petunia made tea when Andromeda arrived. Andromeda washed the morning cups before she left. Neither of them had discussed this arrangement. It had arrived by itself, the way stable things sometimes did, through the patient accumulation of mornings. The kitchen had a quality in 1984 that it had not had in 1981. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of hostility in the particular places where hostility had once lived. Petunia had stopped standing in the doorway with her arms folded. She had started, sometime in 1983, leaving the spare key on the counter by the back door. Neither of them mentioned this. Vernon was in the house in the evenings and at weekends. He had not accepted the situation. He had enclosed it in a particular quality of tight-lipped endurance that functioned as management in the absence of any other option. On the mornings when he had not yet left for Grunnings when Andromeda arrived, they said nothing to each other. This had become, over 3 years, sufficient. Harry and Dudley occupied the same house in the way that children who have never known anything else occupy a shared space, without ceremony, and without the particular friction that arises when people remember they have not always shared it. They were not friends. They ate at the same table and competed for the same toys on certain afternoons, and had developed, between them, the dynamic of children who absorb the emotional weather of the adults around them. Dudley was alert to his father's preferences. Harry was alert to something less specific, something more ambient, the way that a child who has grown up around adults who are carefully managing something tends to develop an attention to undercurrent, a habit of reading what is not being said. He was not anxious. He was watchful. These were not the same thing. Harry had the second bedroom. It had a window. It had been his since he was 20 months old, and it was simply his room, in the way that some things are simply so because there was never a morning when they weren't. The first real question came when Harry was 5. He was sitting on the kitchen floor with his drawing things on a morning in May. He had a red crayon in one hand and was not using it, which meant he was thinking about something, because Harry's drawing things were not objects of distraction, but objects of preparation, something to hold while the words assembled themselves. Andromeda was at the table with the healer's spring report. She had learned, over 4 years, to give the quiet the room it needed. "Where did my mum and dad go?" he said. Not to her exactly, to the red crayon. She put down the report. She had been preparing for this since he was about 2.5, when she had understood what kind of child he was, and how early that kind of child would arrive at this kind of question. She had considered Dumbledore's third condition: do not tell Harry about the wizarding world before the appropriate time, and had found the line she could stand on. The wizarding world was specific. The existence and death of his parents wasn't the wizarding world. It was simply the truth. She told him his parents were wonderful people who had loved him more than anything. They had died because a very bad person had hurt them. It was not their fault. It was not his fault. It was the bad person's fault entirely, and the bad person was gone. Harry was quiet for a moment. He looked at the crayon. "Did the bad person die too?" he said. "His body was destroyed," Andromeda said. This was true. She did not say, "Nothing of him remains." She was not able to say that. She had read the healer's reports too carefully and for too long to say that and mean it. Harry appeared to consider this. The distinction, body destroyed, which was not quite the same as gone, seemed to register, or at least to not be dismissed. He was 5. He was the kind of 5-year-old who heard what you actually said rather than what you intended to say. He drew for another few minutes in silence, the red crayon now moving, and then held up the paper. 2 figures, one with red lines at the head that she understood, after a moment, were meant as a woman's hair. He had produced a likeness from nothing but what he had been told. His mother's hair had been red. Lily had been brilliant and kind. He was drawing someone he had never seen. She took the picture. She told him it was very good, which it was, in the ways that mattered. She put it with the diary. The diary was not a journal. It had never been intended as one. It was a log, dates and observations, begun on the first morning in late November 1981 and maintained without gap since. The healer's reports, excerpted. Harry's own accounts, as he grew old enough to give them, of anything unusual about the scar. Mostly, nothing. The entries ran in their ordinary succession. 7th March 1984. Scar unchanged. No warmth reported. 14th March. Harry notes slight itch. No observable change. Healer advises no action. August 1984. Quarterly examination. No escalation. 14th. February 1985. Harry mentions the scar felt warm for a minute this morning. It passed. Healer consulted by post. Not concerned. 9th April 1986. Spring check. Stable. Unchanged. But there were entries she had begun to return to. Not dramatic ones. She would have acted on a dramatic entry. Small ones. Occasions when Harry mentioned some faint additional sensation, when her own baseline diagnostic sense registered what she had come to think of as a flicker. Something slightly more active than the scar's ordinary quiet. The flickers were brief. They passed. They did not repeat on predictable intervals, or at least not on intervals she could yet identify. She had started marking certain dates in the margin with a small X. She did not know yet what she was looking for. She knew only that the marks were clustering, imprecisely but not randomly, in a way that suggested something on the other side of the dark magic was not entirely still. It was not moving toward Harry. It was not purposeful, as far as she could tell. But it was not nothing. She noted the dates. She would understand the pattern later, when she had more of them. On an evening in the summer of 1986, she stood in the doorway of the second bedroom and watched Harry sleep. He was 6 years old. He slept on his back with both arms at his sides, in the composed manner of a child who had made a considered decision about sleep and was implementing it correctly. The window was open, and Petunia's roses were in bloom in the garden below, and the last light of the evening was coming in at a low angle, and the scar on his forehead was barely visible in it. A pale mark, clean, quiet. He had never slept in the cupboard under the stairs. He did not know that in some other version of his life he would have. He had always had this room, this window, this light coming in at a low angle over Petunia's roses. This was what the choice had made. Among the things the choice had made. A room with a window, and a child who did not know that the window was something that had been decided. Outside, little whinging was exactly as ordinary as it had always been. And in here was a 6-year-old who had survived because his mother had loved him, sleeping because a stranger had read a scan and chosen not to walk away. She went downstairs and put the kettle on. The night it happened was a Tuesday in February, which she would remember later, because Tuesday was the morning she brought the quarterly notes, and Petunia always had the good biscuits on the table for Tuesdays, a private accommodation with the schedule that had never been acknowledged aloud. It was past midnight. Harry was 7 years old. He woke screaming. She had the key now. 5 years of incremental negotiation had produced it, and then the key had produced the habit of keeping it close, and tonight the habit produced itself before she was entirely awake. Coat over her night clothes, door, the 2 streets in the dark, the door at number 4, the stairs. She had been at his room in 4 minutes. He was sitting up in bed with both hands pressed to his forehead and his eyes open. Not the eyes of a child in a nightmare. Harry woke from nightmares in the ordinary way, with the brief, confused quality of someone who had been somewhere else. This was different. He was entirely present. His scar was red. "It burns," he said. He was that kind of 7, matter of fact when there were facts to report. It's not like pain from outside. It's like a pressure from the wrong direction." She sat on the edge of the bed and did not touch the scar. she said. "Tell me when it changes." He sat with his hands pressed to his forehead for what she estimated at a minute, his eyes steady, and then his hands came down. "It passed," he said. She stayed until he fell back to sleep. He did not cry. He did not ask her to stay, which at 4 or 5 he might have done. He was 7, and managing himself, and said good night in the particular formal tone that meant he was doing both. She went to the chair in the corner and stayed there anyway. He fell asleep. She did not. In the morning, she sent the owl from the front garden before she had drunk her tea. The healer arrived at 9. Harry was at school. Petunia was in the kitchen. Tea already made. The more disturbed she was, the earlier the tea appeared. Andromeda had learned this over 6 years, and she took her cup to the back garden and pulled the door closed without being asked. The healer set up in the sitting room. The diagnostic procedure was the same as it had always been. Same instruments, same careful sequence, same professional unhurriedness. What it found was not the same. He was quiet after the first pass. Then he cast the diagnostic again, and Andromeda had learned what that second casting meant. Something had changed. "The dark magic is significantly more active than in previous examinations," he said, with the careful language she had come to recognize as his way of delivering difficult news without delivering it all at once. "And there is something I didn't observe in 1982, or in the monitoring since. The dark magic, the anchor in the scar, it doesn't originate in Harry. It appears to be drawing on something external, something outside the child. Something that is still active." She said, "Active." "Yes," he said. "Yes, I believe so." She went home. She got the diary. She laid the last 5 years of entries across the kitchen table and looked at the margin X marks, the dates she had been noting since 1984 of the small flickers, the warmth reports, the minute long itch. 27 dates over 3 years. She got the copies of the wizarding press she had been keeping and compared. It was not a precise correspondence. The dates were not exact, but the shape was there. Her X marks clustered in the weeks following a particular quality of quiet in the wizarding world's news. Not the quiet of nothing happening, the quiet of something being careful not to be noticed, the kind of stillness that preceded certain whispered rumors, strange animal deaths in Eastern Europe, odd disturbances in reports from areas no one in the ministry seemed interested in investigating, the kind of quiet that gathered around something that was trying not to gather attention. She closed the diary. She packed the report. She was at Hogwarts the following morning. Dumbledore's office had the quality of a room that contained more than fit comfortably in it, and was comfortable anyway, full of instruments and books, and something in a cabinet that moved slowly on its own. She had been here once before, briefly, in 1982. The meeting had taken place in his territory on his terms. This one had the same geography, and she was not inclined to conduct it on the same terms. She laid the healer's report on his desk. She laid the diary open beside it, marked at the relevant pages. "The dark magic in Harry's scar is connected to something external that is still alive," she said. "I would like you to tell me what." He looked at the diary. He read it, not quickly, but with the thorough attention of a man for whom reading carefully was reflex, and who she thought had already known something of what it contained. He set it down. He was quiet for a moment longer than the situation required, which told her he was deciding how much to give. "When I told you in 1982 that the dark magic was residual and stable," he said, "I gave you what I knew, and in the most accurate language I had at the time." He paused. "It is no longer stable, and you have earned more accurate language." He told her, Voldemort had not died when the killing curse rebounded. The curse had destroyed his body. It had not destroyed him. He had survived in a greatly reduced form, diminished past what most would consider survival, something less than a ghost, something that persisted through means Dumbledore was not yet fully able to characterize. He was not in England. He was far from England, greatly reduced, without a body, without the means to reach Harry directly. He was not, in Dumbledore's considered assessment, an immediate threat. He did not say what the dark magic in the scar was connected to. He did not name it. He said, "The connection is a thread, not a wound." It has not harmed Harry, and Dumbledore did not believe it would harm him in the near future. Then he said, "But it will require Harry to be strong, in ways I cannot yet fully specify." She waited. He looked at her across the desk, and for the first time since the kitchen in February 1982, his expression contained something that was not entirely calculation. It was brief. Whatever it was, it crossed his face and was controlled immediately with the ease of a man who had practiced this for a very long time. But she had been reading what people did not say since she was 12, and she read it clearly enough. What moved across his face was guilt. She did not ask him about it. She filed it, the way she filed everything. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." He said, "You earned it." She came back to Privet Drive on a Thursday afternoon in February, and Harry was in the back garden. He was attempting to convince a spider to walk from one hand to the other. The spider was not cooperating. Harry was 7 years old, and he was narrating this situation to the spider in a reasonable, patient tone, as if the problem were a failure of communication rather than a fundamental incompatibility of objectives. He had completely forgotten that his scar had burned 2 nights ago. He had mentioned it once at breakfast in the manner of someone filing a report, and had then moved on, because the pain had passed, and there were spiders to manage. She watched him from the kitchen doorway. He had not heard her come in. He was entirely occupied by the spider, by the cold February light, by the garden bench, by the completely ordinary business of being 7 and outdoors and curious about something small. Something in her chest was clenched in a way that she had no clean category for. It was not quite fear, though there was fear in it. She had just come from a conversation with a 105-year-old wizard who had used the word persists and looked guilty, and it was not quite love, though there was love in it. She had been in this boy's orbit for 5 years, and was not going to pretend otherwise to herself. It was probably both. It was probably other things beside. She thought, "I cannot leave." She was not surprised by the thought. She had been thinking it in one form or another since November 1981. What surprised her, watching a 7-year-old negotiate with a spider in February light after the morning she'd had, was that she still needed to say it. It still had weight. It was still a choice being made. Harry looked up. "Andy," he said, "if you approach them very slowly, they're actually quite reasonable." She came and crouched beside him. She looked at the spider. She said, "What's it doing?" "Refusing," Harry said. "But I think it's coming around." She stayed for the spider. He had been coming to Privet Drive for 6 years. This was the kind of fact that surprised him occasionally, not because it was easy to forget, but because the way it felt did not match the number. 6 years was a long time. It had the weight of a long time. And yet the individual Sundays, the particular quality of a December afternoon on Petunia Dursley's front step, the particular scent of the kitchen in summer, the lavender Andromeda kept in her coat pockets, the step that creaked on the way upstairs, the second one from the top, did not feel like 6 years of accumulated data. They felt like a single continuous thing that had been happening for some time and showed no inclination to stop. He was 28 years old. He looked, this was simply true, and he had long since stopped being sensitive about it, rather older. The lycanthropy had its costs, and one of the costs was a quality of wear that settled on a person the way years of weather settled on stone. Gradually, and then all at once, and then permanently. He had grey at his temples at 28 that belonged to 45. He dressed neatly in the way of someone who had decided that dignity was within his control, even on a budget that did not leave much room for it. Harry took his tea with too much sugar. He had done this since he was old enough to have tea, and Andromeda had said something about it once, and Harry had tried 1 cup without the 3rd spoonful, and had been so visibly disappointed that she had put the sugar bowl back on his side of the table, and never mentioned it again. Remus knew this because he had been present when it happened, and he had stored it in the category of things about Harry that were simply true, and that he was, for reasons he did not examine closely, glad to know. He knew which step creaked on the stairs. He knew that Harry approached any question that interested him with the methodical patience of a person who had learned that good questions deserved room. He knew that Harry watched the adults around him with the close and unobtrusive attention of a child who had absorbed the fact that the adults were managing something without knowing precisely what. He told Harry stories about his parents, not the versions that had accumulated in the months after Voldemort's fall, the myth, the martyred Potters, the boy who lived, but the people. James, who had been an excellent Quidditch chaser and a genuinely terrible loser. He had sulked after a bad match with the wholehearted commitment of a person treating sulking as a competitive sport. Lily, who could complete any potion in the textbook, in under the stated time, and who never, and he said this in the spirit of full honesty, let anyone forget it. He told these stories with care, with the precision of someone who understood that the stories were not entertainment, but inheritance, and that the inheritance needed to be true. Harry listened in the way he listened to everything, with the quiet, filing attention of a child who was constructing a picture from the materials available. The month the full moon fell on a Wednesday, the following Sunday was Remus's planned visit. He sent a brief note. He could not come this week. He could not go into further detail in a letter he was sending to a Muggle house by owl. He sent the note, and he waited. He had learned, over 6 years, the shape of Harry's silences. The letter he received 2 days later was short and entirely ordinary. How are you, Moony? Andromeda says you are welcome whenever. I have been thinking about whether spiders can feel cold. And this was exactly the right note from one angle. And from another angle was the precise outline of a child who had learned not to make his disappointment loud. No follow-up owl came that week. He had not expected one. He had not expected the letter either. Harry was 8 and did not write many letters. He sat with it on the evening of the Sunday he should have been in Surrey and read it 3 times, and then he put it with the others. Harry asked Andromeda on a Tuesday, in the manner he asked things he had been considering for some time, without preamble, in the middle of something else, as if the question had simply finished assembling itself and arrived. Why does Moony always go away for a few days? He had noticed the pattern. He was 8 years old and he paid attention to the shape of things, and the pattern had been consistent for 6 years. Monthly gaps, always the same approximate window, always a brief note, and then no visit, and then the following Sunday as if nothing had interrupted it. He had not named the pattern as lunar, which would require a framework he had not yet been given. But he had noticed the gap's regularity, and Harry noticed regularity. Andromeda had a version of this conversation prepared. She had been updating it for about 2 years, she told him. Remus had been bitten by a particular kind of creature when he was very young. The bite had changed him. There was no cure for it. Once a month, the effects took over, and in that time, he could not be around people he cared about because it would put them in danger. It was not his fault. He had been a child. He was a good person, managing a condition that had been inflicted on him, and he came back every time, without exception, because coming back was who he was. She did not say werewolf. She did not say anything that belonged to the wizarding world specifically. What she said was entirely true. Harry was quiet for a long time. He turned his glass of squash in both hands and looked at the table. He had his mother's quality of thought before speech, the particular stillness of someone who was genuinely considering something rather than simply preparing to respond. He said, "Is it lonely when it happens?" Andromeda said she thought so, yes. He went to the sitting room. He came back with paper and his drawing things and sat at the kitchen table for 15 minutes, occasionally stopping to correct something, occasionally frowning at a line. Then he held out the paper. A man with sandy hair, standing in a garden, a sun in the corner, careful parallel lines for the grass. He had captured something in the figure's posture, weight slightly on one foot, hands at his sides, that was, in the way of a child's drawing, that had gotten something right without entirely knowing how. Recognizably, Remus standing somewhere he was comfortable. "Can you give him that?" Harry said. "When you see him." She took it. She would see him on Sunday. Remus arrived at 9:10 on the following Sunday, with his coat damp and his expression managing itself in the way it did on mornings after a difficult week. He looked 29 in the way she had come to understand, fine and tired, and like a person who had survived something and was not planning to discuss it. She handed him the picture in the hallway before he had taken off his coat. She did not explain it. He could see what it was. He stood in the hallway with it and looked at it. The sandy-haired man, the garden, the sun, the careful grass lines. And his face did the thing it did on certain occasions when he was not quite fast enough. It simply showed what was in it. He said, "I'll just," and moved toward the back garden without finishing the sentence. She let him go. She went to the kitchen. Harry was at the table with the question he had been building all week, which was whether spiders could feel the cold, because the one from under the garden bench had moved into the rose bed, and he was concerned about it. Andromeda poured the tea. She said she thought spiders were probably tolerant of cold, but that the rose bed seemed a sensible choice for winter quarters. 10 minutes later, Remus came back in. His face was composed in the way of a face that has had 10 minutes for composing. He sat down across from Harry and said, in the even, genuinely interested tone he used for things Harry asked about natural philosophy, that actually arachnids had a fascinating relationship with temperature, and the rose bed was an excellent sign. Harry said, "I thought so." They talked about spiders for another 20 minutes. Andromeda washed the cups and did not look at either of them more than necessary. At the end of the afternoon, Remus put on his coat and went down the front path. He reached the gate. He stopped, and he looked back at the house. The sitting room window, the kitchen light still on, the roses cut back for winter in the front garden, the second-floor window where Harry's room was. He had stopped at some point in the past year, not looking back when he left. He could not identify the specific Sunday when it had changed. He had simply begun to look back, the way a person looks back at a place that has become, in some sense he was still in the process of understanding, theirs. He walked back to the station. Harry had always learned more from what was not said than from what was. This was not something anyone had told him. It was something he had discovered gradually, by finding that other people managed without it. Dudley walked directly through any number of silences that Harry found informative. Dudley attended to what his father said. Harry attended to what nobody said. What nobody said, in 9 years of mornings at 4 Privet Drive amounted to rather a lot. He knew magic was real. Dora had demonstrated this when he was 2, at carpet level, with a pig's snout, and he had revised his understanding of the world accordingly. He had not told anyone at school. He had not told Dudley, who would have told Vernon, which would have produced a predictable set of consequences. He knew Andromeda was a witch and Ted was a wizard, and that the healer who came every 2 months in his lime-green robes was not a muggle doctor, and that the instrument the healer used on his forehead was not standard medical equipment by any definition he had encountered. He knew that Remus had a condition connected to a creature. He had worked this out at 7 from the monthly pattern of absences, the brief notes, the resumed Sundays as if nothing had intervened, and that the condition was managed and permanent, and not something Remus had chosen. He had looked at the moon 3 months running, and confirmed the arithmetic. He knew his parents had been killed by a dark wizard. He knew the dark wizard had something to do with what was in his scar. He knew Andromeda had a diary with margin marks in it. He had seen it on the kitchen table. He had noticed the X's. He had not asked, because she would tell him when there was something to tell, and asking before she was ready would not make her more ready, only more careful about the diary. He had been thinking about the central question for approximately 3 weeks before he asked it. He chose the garden wall on an October afternoon because outside was better for difficult questions. There was somewhere to look that was not the other person's face, and the garden had leaves and roses going brown and things to watch that were not the conversation. He sat on the wall and waited until Andromeda had her tea and was settled, and then he asked it without ceremony, because ceremony was not his way. Was the thing that killed my parents the same thing that's in my scar? Andromeda put her cup down on the wall beside her. A rose petal came loose and landed on the path. She was quiet for a moment, in the quality of quiet that meant she was deciding how much and in what order. He had known it would be hard for her to hear. He had factored this in. He had still asked it, because the alternative, continuing not to ask it, waiting for someone to decide it was time, had started to feel dishonest, and he had an instinctive objection to dishonesty. She told him, yes, in a manner of speaking. A very dark wizard had done something to him on the night his parents died. The dark magic from that night had left more than the scar. It had left something inside the scar. Not the mark on his skin, but something beneath it, embedded there. Something she had been monitoring with the healer's help since he was an infant. The dark wizard had not died completely when the killing curse had rebounded. He had survived in a greatly reduced form, far away, greatly diminished, not a current threat. But he persisted, and what was in Harry's scar was connected to that persistence. Dumbledore knew, she said. She had spoken to Dumbledore about it. Harry was quiet. He worked through what she had told him methodically, the way he worked through anything complex. The dark wizard had survived. There was something in his scar connected to that survival. It had been in there since he was an infant, had been watched and logged and examined every 2 months for 9 years, and no one had been able to remove it. Dumbledore knew. He said, "Can I meet Dumbledore?" He said it in the tone that meant he had decided the adults could not refuse the request, only delay it. Andromeda said she would arrange it. She wrote the letter that evening. A reply came within 2 days, which was faster than he had expected, which told him something about the degree to which Dumbledore had been anticipating this particular request. The meeting was at a cafe near Reading, neutral ground as Andromeda had described it, not Privet Drive, not Hogwarts, not anywhere Harry had been. An ordinary place with tables by the window and tea in a pot that had been stewing too long. Harry ordered squash and sat up straight and waited. Dumbledore was already there when they arrived. He was tall and very old, with very long silver hair and a beard to match, and half-moon spectacles that he wore as if they were optional. His eyes were a sharp blue. His nose had a crook in it, broken and healed imperfectly. His robes were technically ordinary for the setting, and not quite managing it. He looked at Harry with the kind of sustained attention that Harry had learned to recognize as different from the ordinary attention adults paid children. It was thorough and assessing, and it contained something that was not quite surprise, but sat very close to it. Harry had known Dumbledore was real. He had seen the 1981 letter on Petunia's kitchen table more than once. He had known there were conditions. He had known there was a very old and very powerful wizard who had made decisions about his life when he was 15 months old. He was polite. He was not awed. He had prepared for this. He asked his 2 questions, as he had decided he would, without preamble. What exactly was in his scar, and what was it connected to? Dumbledore told him. The scar contained dark magic, left there by the dark wizard on the night his parents died. He used the name Voldemort without hedging, which Harry noted approvingly. The dark magic was connected to Voldemort's persistence, to what had survived when his body was destroyed. It was a thread, Dumbledore said, between what persisted and Harry. Not a wound, not an active harm. A connection. He did not say what kind of connection. He did not name what had caused it. He told Harry that understanding more would require the kind of careful and systematic study that neither Harry's age nor his current circumstances could support. He told Harry that Hogwarts, in 2 years, would give him the tools and the grounding for that study. He said this as if it were a reassurance. Harry received it as information. "Thank you," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him with an expression that Harry classed, after a moment's consideration, as recalibration, as if the meeting was proceeding in a different way than anticipated. "You are a remarkable young man, Harry," he said. Harry considered this. "Andromeda said you'd say something like that. I think she meant it as a compliment to you," he added. "She doesn't give them easily." Something shifted in Dumbledore's expression that was, Harry thought, probably amusement at the thing he was not quite able to produce as a smile. They left before Dumbledore did. On the pavement, walking toward the bus stop, Harry said, "He didn't tell me everything." Andromeda said, "No. Are you going to tell me when you know?" "Yes," she said. He nodded. He had learned, by 9, how to tell the difference between things Andromeda said because they were convenient and things she said because they were true. She had never, in 9 years, said something convenient that turned out to be untrue. She said yes, she would tell him. She meant it. That was what he needed. Behind them, Dumbledore was still outside the cafe when Andromeda looked back. She had acquired this habit gradually, over years, looking back when she left, the way Remus had taught her without meaning to, the way a person learned to look back at the things that mattered. What she saw was a man who was 108 years old, standing outside a cafe in Reading, watching a 9-year-old walk away down a grey October pavement with a glass of squash in a paper cup. The expression on Dumbledore's face was the expression of a man doing a calculation he had not expected to need to redo. She thought, "I did this. Not alone." Ted had found the address. Remus had come on Sundays. The healer had come every 2 months for 9 years. But she had started it. And what Dumbledore was looking at, a 9-year-old who had asked what was in his scar in the patient tone of someone who had decided in advance not to panic, who had said thank you and meant it. That was what 9 years of that choice had made. She turned back to Harry. "Shall we find some lunch?" she said. He said, "Can we find somewhere with good chips?" She said she thought they could probably manage that. It had begun with an innocuous fact. There was a healer from St. Mungo's who visited a Surrey address every 2 months. The healer was discreet, but the wizarding world was not large, and somewhere in the machinery of medical record-keeping, someone had said something to someone else about an unusual case. A child with unidentified dark magic in a scar, the name Potter attached. And the name Potter was not a name that passed through conversations without leaving a mark on the people who heard it. Andromeda had known this risk existed since 1981. She had accepted it the way she accepted risks smaller than the alternative, with her eyes open and with the understanding that if the choice had consequences, she would be present when they arrived. By August of 1990, Harry had been monitored by a St. Mungo's healer for nearly 9 years. He was 10 years old. He was inside the house on the evening it happened, in the sitting room, doing what he did on hot Tuesday evenings when concentration was difficult, reading or drawing or conducting a methodical survey of the garden bench's spider population. He was inside the house, and the bond of blood held while Harry was inside, and Andromeda was walking back from the post office at 7 in the evening when she saw the figure at the far end of Privet Drive. She stopped. She assessed. Then she walked toward it. The figure was wrong for Privet Drive, in the way that certain people were wrong for ordinary places. Not by their appearance precisely, but by the quality of their presence. People who lived on Privet Drive walked with the particular ease of people going home, occupying a space they knew by habit. This person was arriving with intention. They were tall, and their clothing was wrong for August, too substantial, too formal, the kind of clothing that worked in a setting where the weather was managed rather than endured. Their hair was pale blonde and worn long. They were moving toward number 4 with the measured, purposeful quiet of a man who had already done his reconnaissance and had arrived to confirm something he already believed he knew. Andromeda had known Lucius Malfoy before she was close enough to see his face clearly. She had known who Narcissa married, even from the distance of her disownment. The aristocratic blonde man with the Wiltshire estate. The Death Eater sympathies purchased his way out of by claiming Imperius. She had read his name in the papers in 1982 when he walked out of his hearing free. She had noted it the way she noted things she might eventually need to know. He was 15 feet from the gate of number 4 when she stepped in front of him. She had her wand in her hand before she spoke. She had survived the First Wizarding War by not giving people who meant harm the advantage of the first move. She had not survived 9 years of standing between Harry Potter and everything the wizarding world might send toward him by being slower than the situation required. She said, in the voice she reserved for moments that required precision rather than volume, "Lucius." He stopped. He looked at her with the expression of a man adjusting a plan. He said, "Andromeda, you should not be here. I was simply—" She did not let him finish. She used a binding spell, a clean restraint that locked his wand arm, and a second that held him against the lamp-post at the street's edge, and then she pressed the modified protean charm she wore on her left wrist, the one she had arranged with a ministry liaison 3 years ago. One press, and a signal went to a desk in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement that was monitored at all hours. Personnel would arrive within minutes. Lucius Malfoy stood against the lamp-post with the expression of a man who was reassessing the degree to which a situation had gone sideways. He was held securely. He was not in pain. He was contained, which was sufficient for the present purpose. "I have not committed a crime," he said. "You have not yet reached the gate," Andromeda said. Whether arriving at it would have constituted a crime is something the Ministry will be pleased to determine. I would suggest not saying anything further until they arrive." He looked at her with the calculating flatness she recognized from the Black family's circles, the expression of someone deciding whether a situation was salvageable and arriving, with visible displeasure, at the conclusion that it was not. She looked back with the expression she had been refining since she was 12 years old, which was the expression of a person who had paid a significant personal price to be exactly who she was, and had not, in the years since, regretted it sufficiently to reconsider. The Ministry arrived in 7 minutes, 2 auras in plain robes, efficient and unsurprised in the way of people who had been briefed and were proceeding according to a plan rather than responding to chaos. They took Lucius Malfoy off the lamp-post and off the street with the brisk competence of people who had paperwork waiting and intended to finish before morning. Vernon Dursley had appeared in the front doorway at some point during this, in his shirt-sleeves, furious in the concentrated way of a man whose suburban Tuesday had produced something at his lamp-post. He said several things. Andromeda did not address them. Petunia was in the doorway behind him, pale with her arms folded. She did not faint. She watched. Harry was visible through the sitting-room window. He had not come to the door. Dumbledore arrived 22 minutes after the Ministry. He walked down Privet Drive in long dark robes in the August evening, drawing the kind of looks from the remaining spectators that Andromeda knew. By now, Petunia found specifically excruciating. He did not adjust himself for the neighbours' comfort. He never did. He looked at the empty lamp-post. He looked at Andromeda. He looked at the sitting-room window, where Harry was still at the table, visible, apparently drawing, apparently undisturbed. Then he walked to where Andromeda stood on the pavement, and they faced each other. He said, "I was wrong to resist your presence here. Harry is safer with you than without you." He said it without building to it. She had not needed to hear it in the 9 years since he had called her an unknown variable and allowed her to stay. She had not required his endorsement. She had still needed to hear it. "Thank you for admitting it," she said. He said, "I am not often wrong." She said, "I know." He left. The Ministry concluded their business with a quiet competence that left no mark on the street. The lamp-post was empty. Privet Drive resettled into itself with the determination of a street that had decided, collectively, that it was not the kind of street where these things occurred. She went inside. Harry was at the kitchen table with a glass of squash and his drawing things. He was drawing a street rendered from slightly above, with regular rows of houses on either side. In the middle of the street, a figure, small, in a dark coat, facing someone else, a figure slightly taller who had not yet been given a face. "Is everything all right?" he asked, without looking up. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He went back to the drawing. He trusted this because she said yes, when she meant yes and no, when she meant no, and he had understood, over 10 years of paying the kind of attention he paid, that when she said no, she said it quickly, without the pause that meant she was working out the language. She had said yes, and she had said it without pause. She sat down across from him. She did not make tea. She watched him work, careful, methodical, getting the street's perspective right with the patience of someone who had decided that perspective was worth doing correctly and had set the time aside for it. After a few minutes, he held the drawing out so she could see it. A street. A small figure in a dark coat. The taller figure across from her now had a shape, contained, formal, but still no face. "Is that me?" she asked, pointing to the small one. "Yes," Harry said. "What are you going to do with the other one?" He looked at the drawing. he considered. "I haven't decided yet," he said. He took it back and went on working. She stayed at the table. Outside, Privet Drive was dark and quiet and entirely itself. Inside, a 10-year-old was drawing a street scene with the seriousness it deserved. She thought, I was right to stay. I was right every morning for 9 years. She did not say it aloud. The drawing said it more clearly than she could. She was older than she had expected to feel. This was not, she understood, an unusual complaint. She had simply not anticipated that the gap would begin this early or feel this particular. She was the age she was, and the age she felt was not it, and the distance between the two had been growing since approximately 1982, which was, she was aware of the precision, the year that a dark-haired witch had found lodgings 2 streets away and made it her project to be at Petunia's door every morning before 9 o'clock. 9 years was a long time. She had not wanted it. This remained accurate. She had not wanted the child, and had not wanted the arrangement, and had not wanted the daily presence of someone she had not invited, and could not remove, and she maintained this position because it was correct. She had simply, and this was the difficulty, stopped being able to imagine a Tuesday without it. This was not warmth. She had been clear on this with herself since 1981. She had not loved the boy. She had cared for him, fed him, clothed him, a room with a window, a school appropriate for the neighborhood. She had not mistreated him. She had been present in the way the letter required, and had not found it in herself to produce the warmth that other people appeared to bring to other children without effort. What she could not account for, and had stopped trying to account for, was the Tuesday. That she had built a life around a knock at the door at 8:30. On an October morning in 1990, Petunia was at the kitchen table when Andromeda arrived. She had been there for 20 minutes, which was not unusual. The morning was Petunia's territory, the hour before anyone else required anything of her. But this particular morning, she had the expression she recognized in herself on certain occasions. The expression of someone who had been waiting for a conversation and had made a decision about it. Andromeda came in from the front door with the key she had had for 6 years and paused in the kitchen doorway in the way she paused before entering rooms where Petunia was already sitting. Reading the room, Petunia had come to understand, checking what was required before proceeding. "Sit down," Petunia said. Andromeda sat down. She did not make tea. She waited with the patient, unhurried quality that was one of the things Petunia had come to rely on. When you were preparing to say something, Andromeda gave you the room to say it. "He's going to that school in September," Petunia said. "Isn't he?" Not a question. Since August, when the letter had arrived addressed to his room, not to any cupboard. The second bedroom, the one with the window, the one that had had a flat-pack cot in it since he was 20 months old. It had not been a question. Harry had read it at the kitchen table with the expression of someone confirming something already known, and that had been that. September. The school. The life he had been prepared for, since before he had the words to say so. "Yes," Andromeda said. "And then you won't need to be here every day." "No." She paused. "Not every day." The kitchen was quiet. The October light came through the window at a low angle across the garden, which had gone from its summer colors to a resigned gold, the roses cut back to their thorns. The garden settled into itself for winter. A long silence that was not hostile. Petunia had been generating hostile silences her whole adult life, and knew exactly what they felt like. And this was not one. She turned her cup in her hands. "I wrote a letter," she said, "when I was a child." She had not intended to say this. She had intended to discuss the logistics of September, the station arrangements, what the house would be with Harry away at school. She had not intended to say this. But she had been carrying it for a long time, and the drawer she had put it in had been opened at some point in the past 9 years, and now the thing was not lying quietly anymore. She said, when Lily got her first letter. From that school. She did not say Hogwarts. She had never found a neutral way to say it. I wrote to the headmaster. I asked if I could come too. The garden was very still. A bird moved through the rose bed. I wanted to go, Petunia said. Her voice was flat. She was making it flat. I had always wanted to. She walked through a door every September, and I could see the door, and I could not open it. He wrote back. The headmaster. She stopped. He was very kind about it. She never said what the letter said. The answer was obvious. Andromeda was not a person who needed the obvious stated. I was jealous of her, Petunia said. I was always jealous of Lily. From the time she was 9 years old, and a strange man came to the house and told her she was special. I was not special. I was the one who stayed. She was the one who got to go. And she was brilliant, and everyone could see it. And I was here. She looked at the garden. She died, and the boy appeared on my doorstep with her eyes, and he was proof of everything that had ever been on the other side of that door. Her voice was entirely flat. Andromeda was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know what it is to be refused entry to a world that was supposed to be yours. She said it without emphasis, not drawing a comparison, simply placing the fact in the room. My own family decided I didn't belong, because I married the wrong person. Petunia looked at her. She had known, in an abstract way, that Andromeda had been disowned. She had known it the way she knew many things about the world the boy occupied, from the edges, imperfectly, by inference. She had not, until this moment, understood it as a category of experience that applied to them both. Neither woman said so. Neither of them had to. The kitchen was quiet, and the October light moved slowly across the table, and they looked at each other for a moment, the specific moment of recognizing something, and then they did not look at each other, and that was sufficient. They were not friends. They were two women who had spent 9 years in the same kitchen, managing the same situation from different positions, and what existed between them was the habit of each other, the knowledge of each other's edges, the specific relief of a person who knew where the line was and had never crossed it. After a while, Petunia turned her cup in her hands. "Will you tell him?" she said. She stopped. She tried again. "Tell him that his mother was brilliant. She was brilliant at everything she tried to do. I never told her." Her gaze went to the garden before she finished the sentence. "I should have." Her voice was entirely flat. "I'll tell him," Andromeda said. Petunia nodded, not turning from the window. They drank their tea. Andromeda washed the cups without being asked, as she always did, and put her coat on, and left at the usual time. Petunia watched her go through the kitchen window, the dark wool coat, the gate, the brief look back before she walked on. Andromeda had been doing this for years, looking back from the gate. She had picked it up somewhere, from one of the people she had gathered around the boy. Petunia let the curtain fall straight. She went back to her tea, which had gone cold. The kitchen was entirely ordinary. The October roses were cut back to their thorns. The morning light was doing what morning light did in October, which was to take its time. She had said the thing she had been carrying. It had not, she found, made her feel lighter. It had made her feel real, which was not the same thing, and was perhaps better. She sat at the table for another 20 minutes after the tea was cold. Then she got up and did what the morning required. Andromeda walked back to her lodgings, thinking about a flat voice, saying something that was not flat. She would tell him. Not now. He was 10, and there were things you said to a 10-year-old and things you saved until they could land in the right place. But there would be a time, after Hogwarts, after the beginning of everything that was waiting for him, when Lily Potter's son would need to know that his mother had been brilliant, and that her sister had known it and been jealous of it for 30 years and had finally, in a kitchen in October, put it down. She had promised. She would keep it. She thought, there was a person in Petunia Dursley all along. She kept very still, so still for so long that the stillness looked like absence. It was not. She walked the 2 streets in the October light and thought about doors that couldn't be opened and families that decided you didn't belong, and the specific shape of being refused entry to the world that was supposed to be yours. She thought about a headmaster who had written back to a child very kindly. She thought, we did not choose the same thing. We chose very different things, but we started from the same place. She thought, I stayed for the scans. She thought, it was also this. The letter arrived on his birthday, addressed to the 2nd bedroom, number 4, Privet Drive. Not to any cupboard. He had always had the 2nd bedroom, the one with the window, the one he had known as his room since before he could say so, and he would not understand until he was older what it meant that the address had always known this too. He read it at the kitchen table. Andromeda was already there, as she was every morning, with the supply list she had prepared in March, in the practical way she prepared for things she knew were coming. She watched him read. She said nothing until he was done. Ready? She said. He had known about Hogwarts since he was 5 and started asking questions that couldn't be postponed. He had known about the letter since he was 9. He had known about the supply list since Andromeda showed it to him in spring. He found, nonetheless, that knowing something was coming and having it arrive were different countries, adjacent but separate. Yes, he said. He mostly meant it. Diagon Alley was a Saturday in August. Harry, Andromeda, and Nymphadora, who had finished her last year at Hogwarts in June and was now waiting out the weeks before Aura training began the way she spent most waiting periods, at speed. He had been told about Diagon Alley. All 3 of them had described it, in 3 different ways, none of which turned out to be adequate preparation for stepping through a brick wall into somewhere that operated by entirely different rules than the world he had spent 11 years in. The leaky cauldron was dark and cramped. Then Andromeda tapped the bricks in a particular sequence, and the wall opened. For the first time in his life, he did not try to find words for what he was seeing. He stood in the entrance and let it be exactly what it was. The color of it, the noise of it, the density of a street selling things he had no category for, the people in robes moving past as if this were ordinary, merely Tuesday. He stood in the arch between the 2 worlds and did not move and did not speak for 1 entire minute. Andromeda stood beside him. She let him stand. Then Harry said, "All right," in the tone that meant he was ready to proceed. They proceeded. Vault 687 was reached by cart by a steep descent through Gringotts underground passages. Harry maintained a calm expression throughout, which required some effort when the cart moved in ways that suggested the rails below might be optional. He had a policy of not performing his internal states until he understood them. The vault doors opened. He stood in front of his parents' gold. He thought of Remus telling him that James Potter had not been careful with money and had never needed to be, because the money was always there, said with the affectionate accuracy of someone who had chosen to remember a person truly rather than perfectly. He thought of Andromeda on the garden wall last spring, saying, "I should also tell you something your aunt asked me to tell you, that your mother was brilliant. She was brilliant at everything she tried." Her voice had been careful, in the way it was careful when she was carrying something she had been asked to carry. He had said, "Why hasn't she told me herself?" Andromeda had said, "I think she finds the words very difficult. I don't think that means the words aren't there." Standing in the torchlight in front of his parents' gold, Harry thought about his mother being brilliant at everything she tried, and his father not being careful with money and not needing to be, and the woman on Privet Drive who had written to a headmaster as a child, asking if she could come too. He filed all of this in the appropriate place. He would need it later. Ollivander's was narrow and quiet, and a very old man appeared from the shelves with the quality of someone who had been waiting without appearing to have waited. Harry was measured and handed boxes and tried wands in the way he worked through anything requiring iteration, without impatience, with attention to what the last attempt had established. The 11th box contained holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, supple. He took the wand, and the warmth came up his arm in one clean wave, immediate, like remembering something he had not known he had forgotten, and the sparks came from the tip in red and gold. Harry thought, "Oh, there it is." He thanked Mr. Ollivander with the precise and genuine quality he had been taught, only when he meant it. On 1st September 1991, they came to King's Cross. Remus was there in his best mended robes. Pressed for this occasion, as they had been for the first Sunday, he came to Privet Drive 9 years ago. It was a non-full moon week. He and Andromeda had confirmed this in advance, as they always did. He was 31, and he looked it in the particular way. Fine, and worn in the places lycanthropy wore you. But here, present, not somewhere else alone. Nymphadora was there. She tripped over Harry's trunk before they reached the barrier, a stumble, a flail, one hand catching the trolley, and turned her hair involuntarily lime green in the half-second of alarm. Harry laughed. It was the full-body laugh, both fists clenching with the effort of it, the laugh that had not changed in 9 years except in pitch. He stopped walking for 3 full seconds. Nymphadora, with her lime-green hair, looked at him. "Every time," she said. "I can't help it," he said. "It's still the funniest thing." She put her arm briefly around him and let go. She was going to begin aura training in October. He was going to begin Hogwarts in 45 minutes. They were both, in some sense, leaving at once. Ted made sure the trunk was properly settled. He was solid and quiet and good at this, as he was good at most practical things. Andromeda stood beside him in her wool coat, watching with the expression she wore when something she had been waiting for was now happening, and she was not going to make a production of it. Petunia was there at the edge of the group with Vernon and Dudley. She had come. She was here. He said goodbye to Remus, who shook his hand and then thought better of it, and pulled him briefly in. He said goodbye to Nymphadora, who told him his hair looked terrible, turned her own hair into a perfect replica of his, and grinned. He said goodbye to Ted, who told him to write and meant it. He said goodbye to Andromeda last. She looked at him for a moment. "You already know everything I would say." "I know." "Write anyway." He turned toward the barrier. Petunia stepped forward. She put her arms around him, briefly, and let go before either of them had to decide what it was. He had not expected it. She had not expected it. It was not comfortable in the way of expected things. It was the kind of true that did not require comfort to remain true. He did not say anything. He nodded once, the nod for things too large to speak yet. Then he walked through the barrier. The platform slid away behind him, Ted's hand raised, Nymphodora's lime-green hair, Andromeda's dark coat, Remus beside her. And then the barrier, and Petunia with her arms folded, and then none of it. England in September going past the window. He thought about the first story Remus had told him about his father, a boy who had gotten completely lost in the castle on his very first day, and insisted, firmly and incorrectly, to everyone who offered to help, that he was not lost. Remus had found this funny for 31 years, and the funny had not diminished. He thought about Nymphodora's nose on a carpet in 1982. He had been 2 years old, he had not remembered it. Andromeda had told him, and the telling had been sufficient. He thought about Andromeda, sitting in a kitchen in November 1981, in a house she had no claim to, holding a cup of tea that had not been offered kindly, watching a sleeping child she had known for approximately 2 hours. She had told him this last week on the garden wall. He had asked why she stayed. She had said, "Because the scans told me I should." And then I stayed too long to leave. He watched England go past, the particular light of September, the light that meant something was starting. And he thought, I am the person I am, because she couldn't look away. Not only her. Remus, 9 years of non-full moon Sundays. Ted, who had held him as an infant and known how. Nymphodora, who had shown him the first small piece of what the world contained on a grey carpet with a pig's snout. Petunia, who had been there, who had been exactly as present as she could manage, which was not warmth, but was not nothing. But Andromeda had started it. She had read a scan and chosen not to walk away. And everything that came after, every name he had, every story, every morning that had a shape because someone knocked at the door, came after that. He knew who he was. He knew what he was carrying. He knew the people who had chosen to carry it with him. England in September went past the window,